Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's a few days before the Christian holiday. Happy holidays to everybody, regardless of your beliefs. It's nice to have that time for communion, festivity, and family. And that's what it's about. That's what it's about. But, I made an episode the other day about racism. Not many people watch it, and most people probably don't care. The average white American doesn't want to hear about racism very often. And I can understand to some level why. It includes your history a lot. But it needs to be said because you don't understand jazz in any way if you don't understand race. And a lot of Europeans have asked me to talk about race more because they're not really close to an honest perception of it. They don't get a black perspective very often. They get usually American media through the lens of their media. And so it's usually going to end up being pro-white and pro-establishment and have the narrative that says what the main status quo says. And so it's important sometimes for me to elaborate on that because I dabble in it a lot and reference it a lot. But there's plenty of people in Europe who comment, message me, personal message me, and ask for a little bit more in depth. So, and the most important part to understand, and I can't stress this enough, I've said it before, but I'm going to say it till I'm dust and bones. If you don't understand the environment and situation an art form is made in, you can't ever hear what it's telling you. And that's true for paintings, it's true for just about every form of art. It's an expression of the artist, okay? And jazz is the most immediate and honest rendition of my experience and how I feel. And I mentioned this briefly in the last episode, and I meant to come back to it, but by the time I got back to it, it was already 40 minutes in, so I'm like, I was going to put it as a precursor to this episode. The act of improvisation in jazz, taking and ignoring what's written on the page and adding your own flair, your own personality, your own emotional context to something. Improvisation is directly linked to emoting. They couldn't be more in step with each other. And so you're giving me this art form where I can express how I feel, honestly, via a coded message. I'm going to tell you about that racism. Maybe not all the time, but it's going to be in there. So anybody who thinks that jazz, especially from the 30s through the 60s, doesn't think that the American experience is being exposed and condemned with most notes that are being played on some level. The prison populations, the murder rates, those things I showed you and talked about, it makes it very difficult for a black male to be emoting via improvisation and not to express some of that fear, tyranny, and sorrow. And it comes coupled with expressing their addictions, their loves, their angers, their disappointments, their optimism, their hopes. Again, personality ends up being the parameters that will dictate how I handle my experience within my environment. So as I'm emoting via improvisation, my environment that I've lived through, my experience within that environment, my personality will all start to reflect those conditions and how I choose to handle them. And you can hear the difference between how a Morgan and a Mobley handles the same environment, their own unique experiences in that environment, and how different their personalities are. And personality does more to dictate the sound and the tone of a horn player than any other facet of his playing. That is what informs my tone, my embouchure, my inflection, my ferocity, my laid-back laissez-faire. It's all an expression of my personality. So when you get to know a player's personality, his environment, and his experience, it is these three brushstrokes, and only these three brushstrokes, that can tell you what a jazz player is improvising and thus what he is emoting. It's so the key to hearing and feeling jazz when you listen to it. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of notes and some brilliant playing, but you ain't feeling anything. And the incredible playing can move you. These men are virtuoso by default. The virtuosity was never the intent. The virtuosity was a byproduct of the consistently going there, practicing, rehearsing, because it was a place of safety. So it's just important for people who haven't been with the channel long, or those who want to kind of even argue and say, oh, it's not always about the black experience. It is. It is. And we have to talk about race and understand the experience of black men in America to understand jazz, to feel what these men are trying to say to us, and how they're really trying to fight for a better tomorrow. That's the underlying message. So when I talk about race, and most of you don't want to hear it, I understand. Most of you know plenty about it. But there's people who do ask about it. That's why I talk about it. On top of the fact I feel compelled to speak about it regardless of people asking me. But I do get plenty of people wanting me to expand on that. And I try to limit it to where it's not an overbearing presence, but there's times where it needs to be a predominant feature, because I want people to hear jazz the way I hear it. It's electrifying when you hear the screams of sorrow coming through a horn player's horn. When you get to know who a guy is, it becomes so much easier to know what that guy's saying through that horn. And if you had a good friend of yours play you some saxophone versus a complete stranger, who are you going to have a better inkling of what they're expressing? The guy you know his story. So you know he's talking about how much his wife pissed him off this last 6 months. But if you don't know none of that, it's just notes. So you have to study the history, you have to know the times, the difference between the 30s and the 60s. All of this time scale, this lineage, is absolutely integral in having any concept or understanding or the ability to feel and hear jazz. And until you're feeling it, you're not hearing it. You're just listening to it. And the magic, the potency is all in that next step, where the listener tries to understand the background of the 1812 overture, of the Mona Lisa, of the Last Supper. When you try to understand the context that this was done in, suddenly what the artist is saying to you has more relevance. And unlike a lot of great pieces of art which are commissioned, a jazz player has only one commission. What's on my mind today? How does my soul feel today? And if you think a black man's not going to vent some of his fuck you for all this bullshit we've lived through for these generations, you're in denial. We're going to move on. That's part 2 to what I had to say the other day. Emoting and improvisation are linked. And you can't separate them. You just can't. And if you were capable of hearing Kurt Cobain's great loathing and angst and his unsatisfaction, if you're capable of hearing that, or the unhappiness of Johnny Rotten, Mick Jones in the Clash, if you can hear what punk rock is saying to you, if you can get the message of what a metal band is screaming about, and if you can hear how music and film expresses emotion and context, gives you the setting. So often the image alone wouldn't create the mood. It's the music behind it that gives you that, oh, now I have a dimensions here. There's this vision, but now there's also this soundscape, and now I have an area with which I can have a concept of what's happening. Music does shape emotion, has all these landscapes to it. The black experience informs jazz constantly. Moving on. I'm going to discuss with you right now 5 things most people don't know about Blue Note Records. And we talked about Blue Note a lot this week. And sometimes I get away from Blue Note, listen to other labels, dive in, and then I come back to Blue Note and I'm just reminded of just how precious the Blue Note discography is. It's hallowed ground. Okay, and then I've discussed that infinitely. But it's so special on so many levels. And when you have the entire body of work, the 400 records or so from 1500 to 4300, when you have that 400 album body of work, and you have to kind of know even the 10-inch era to know some of the changes in the label, and then what happens after the sale. You need to kind of know some of that to understand how it changes after the sale. But there's eras to Blue Note. And 55 to 66, 67, even I would say 65, honestly. There's a decade where Blue Note is this very special thing that no other jazz label really even has a hand that's close to it. And I'm going to give you 5 reasons why that's true. First, number 5. Blue Note and that whole line of Alfred Lion, Frank Wolf released titles in the 1500 series, which is 100 records, and then the 273 up into the sale in the 4000 series. There's not a single greatest hits in there. There's no label compilations in there. There's no Christmas records. Not a one. There's no artist collections. They don't put out albums that aren't legitimate recording sessions that are kind of almost immediate. From recording to release, some of these things came out fairly quick. Not quite The Simpsons or South Park in terms of how fast they're regurgitating what's happening, but Blue Note was turning that stuff around pretty quickly. And there was no time for greatest hits. There was no vision of Christmas records. There was no concept of, let's put out a Blue Note sampler record to fill the gap. There was no gaps to be filled. Those things are usually money grabs, and it's a good week to release a record, it's a good week for sales, we have nothing ready to go, let's put this compilation out that weekend, hopefully we can sell a few thousand copies of that. And if you compare it to the landscape of what else is happening in jazz, labels like Argo have at least 3 Christmas records, one with Kenny Burrell, which I actually don't have, I want to get it. He passed it up hundreds of times, and now that I kind of want it, it's actually kind of gone up in price, and I don't really want to pay big bucks for it. But here's 2 Ramsey Lewis albums that are nice little swinging Christmas records, and I played them as DJs at a lot of holiday parties. But Verve has this great Jimmy Smith record, which was issued with a few different covers because it was issued a few different holiday seasons, so they're actually not different records. But almost all these labels do Christmas collections of Broadway hit records. Riverside has some weird little subcategory releases that aren't current. You know, just like plays Kern, there's this weird little things that these labels have done. Prestige is all kinds of weird. Blue Note never takes a session from those eras and then reissues it later in their album sequence as a new album. Prestige does that all the time. You can buy the same Monk, Miles, Sonny Rollins record 3 different times. And if you're not knowing the titles and the dates and looking carefully, you'll buy the same record 3 times. Because Prestige doesn't give no shits about that. So that's one of the things that makes them so special, is they're so not driven by just the business side of things. And that's an important revelation because it tells you some of the other things where I speak of the integrity of the label. That's a clear-cut fiscal example of them not being driven by just making money. Compilations, greatest hits, they probably could have put out 2 or 3 Jimmy Smith's greatest hits over the years, a 3 Sounds greatest hits, Jazz Messenger's greatest hits. They don't do that. They could have reissued the Miles stuff, the Monk stuff, the Coltrane stuff as those guys got more popular at other labels. They don't do that. They're working on what they're working on now. Their art is focused on the here and the now and the current edge of where this black music was. And that was all they were focused on. So number 5, there's no bullshit releases. From 1500 to 4272, it's 372 records. There's a few numbers actually that don't make it in, that don't get issued. But there's stuff from the vaults that's coming out now on Tone Poet and stuff that's actually adding to that number some. But for the most part, the actual releases of the Blue Note era, it's just title after title of incredible, innovative, fresh jazz. Nothing like it in the jazz kingdom. Nothing. The next thing I want to talk about is how much the Jazz Messengers are Blue Note. And you can define that in several different ways. One, the sound of Blue Note, and I'm not talking the entire body of the history of the label. I'm talking when someone says, well, the Blue Note sound, it's the sound of hard bop, it's the sound of the Jazz Messengers. And so it's very much the definition of what Blue Note is synonymous with what the Jazz Messengers are. But as Blue Note is coming through the 50s, once they interlope with Blakey in 54, and then Blakey goes to Columbia and makes this record and a second record with Mobley, Watkins, Bird, and Horace Silver and Blakey. A great record, not too tough to find. For a good price, you can get a nice copy of this on Columbia. And this is one of the most edgy, dangerous records Columbia ever put out in the 50s. This was black music. This wasn't polished Nat King Cole, cleaned up for the folks. This wasn't safe Oscar Peterson. This was the Wu-Tang Clan in terms of its appearance, its sincerity, its lack of posturing, its lack of shining anybody's shoes. There's nothing bow tie about these men. Look at them. It's absolutely serious in its condition. This is Columbia's one of their most prestigious releases, and it's ahead of the curve. Monk's not coming here for a long time. Miles is going to be signed in this era, but doesn't have nothing come out until 57. This was a big deal at Columbia, and the nation's first real look into the sound of black hard bop. Doesn't have national distribution until this moment. And it's important to understand that not only was the Jazz Messengers who defined the sound of what Blue Note sounds like, this body of musicians, when you really look at it, it's like the moment that Alfred Lion and Frank Wolf get what they're going to do. Okay? And so in the 10-inch era, they're very much feeling their way around, trying to figure out, how can we do this? And they're releasing stuff from Vogue in France, getting like weird Clifford Brown, Dizzy Gillespie sessions. They're doing a lot of interesting guys from different eras. They're releasing Sidney Bechet records and issuing that stuff. Guys like Frank Foster, Sal Salvador, very disparate in their sound. Gil Mel, very different. There was no Blue Note sound in the early 50s. It was a hodgepodge of many different aspects of jazz, from kind of the new cool to Cats on the Swing era, Dixieland sound. Some of the new sounds were coming into play with guys like Monk, but it was all still very much viscous and unclear. You don't listen to Blue Note 10 inches and hear the Blue Note sound or see the direction the label's going. And when you look at the body of work that Blue Note does in this golden moment, this era, this decade, so much of it is led by the jazz messenger family tree. And I think a lot of us kind of lose sight of that. I'm going to list off a name of Jazz Messenger alumni who led sessions at Blue Note, and it's impressive. Of course, Horace Silver, who makes 20-some records. Art Blakey, who, of course, is the Jazz Messengers for all intents and purposes once Silver leaves. And all those Jazz Messengers records that he does. Donald Byrd, who's on those Columbia records, he makes infinite records as a sideman and as a leader at Blue Note. Hank Mobley, who leaves with Silver. They make that record at Epic, and then he signs with Blue Note, and he makes an incredible string of records. Lee Morgan, who has 6 records in the late 50s that are a landmark. He works with the Messengers, makes some of the most incredible recordings with that band. Leaves for VJ for a little while, then comes back and is again a major force as a solo and as a Blue Note guy. Curtis Fuller, who actually joins the Messengers after his 3 or 4 records at Blue Note as a leader himself. But he's very much part of that sound and that circle, and they're kind of guesting on each other's records, and he ends up in the Messengers from 60 to 64 or so, off and on. Johnny Griffin. The second great lineup is the one that's kind of the most forgotten, with Spanky DeBrest and Jackie McLean's in there for a little moment. Sam Dockery's in that second group, Wilbur Hardin. And most of that group doesn't get the same exposure at Blue Note. And a lot of those records that group recorded were on Pacific, on Jubilee, on Bethlehem. They were on a string of labels in 1956, 57, I guess. And they're on 6 different labels that year. And so some of the guys from that band don't get into the Blue Note family quite as much. Wayne Shorter. Lee Morgan goes to VJ, works with Wayne, comes back to Blue Note and says, Art, I know this guy. His name is Wayne Shorter. He's going to be the next thing. He's going to be the next great composer, writer, and leader of what the sound of jazz is going to be in the late 60s. And Shorter has a absolutely profound of impact on not just the Jazz Messengers, but on jazz. And he propels the Second Miles Quintet to the great heights that it reaches. Freddie Hubbard. Hubbard is in that circle. He's a messenger off and on for quite a long time, and his circle of records and the impact he has on Blue Note is absolutely impressive. We forget Kenny Dorham is in the Messengers briefly off and on. He has quite a few records at Blue Note. Lou Donaldson. He's not a messenger very long, but he does play on the Birdland stuff with Clifford Brown, and it's a pretty impressive network of jazz messenger guys that are all making records synonymously, simultaneously, and spreading that sound and defining what Blue Note sounded like in 57, 58, 59, 60. It's really crazy. Walter Davis Jr., there's a lot of guys. Some of the guys that don't make records as leaders but do show up as sidemen, Benny Golson, Doug Watkins, Bobby Timmons doesn't make any records as a leader at Blue Note. He makes records at Prestige and Riverside. Wilbur Hardin, he plays in that second great group, and he doesn't make any records as a leader at Blue Note. Cedar Walton doesn't make any records as a leader, but he's on a lot of Blue Note side work. Reggie Workman. The bass players, it seems like Workman, Jamie Merritt, Watkins, and DeBrest. None of those guys got records as leaders, it seems like. But of that group, Timmons and Golson are probably the biggest names, but all the other big names in the Jazz Messengers in this period, they are the Blue Note family, and that's the Blue Note sound. So I think a lot of people don't realize just how much the Jazz Messengers, Blakey and Silver, and that sound and that groove and that strut impacted Alfred Lion. He hears what these cats are doing and goes, yeah, that's it. That's what we need to do. Okay? And it becomes very narrow, the focus of Blue Note, for a good 4 or 5 years. And it's a wonderful phenomenon, and something that a lot of people without the breadth of the canon of Blue Note can really grasp how Jazz Messenger centric it really is. It's not about a lot of the fringe artists, especially in this moment, 57 to 61. It's about that group. That's Blue Note. Number 3. After this record here, 1536, the great J.R. Monteros, who's a fine player and makes a lot of other great sessions on other labels. This, from my memory, is the last record made by a white cat as a leader at Blue Note. 1536. Before this, of course, you have guys like Yoda Hip, a gal from Germany, a friend of theirs. Gil Mel makes, I believe, 4 10-inches and a 12-inch record early on. In the 10-inch era, there's a pretty good mixed cast of black and white guys. But once this album comes out in 1536, which is probably late 55, early 56, it kind of closes the door on them even having any interest in recording white musicians. And a few do show up as sidemen, Pepper Adams most notably, but even guys like the Bill Evans, the Stan Getzes, the Jerry Mulligans, the Chet Bakers. Blue Note has zero interest in signing any of those guys. And remember, those guys actually had fiscal clout. A guy like Chet Baker had some Columbia records. He can sell records. Stan Getz was a pretty big name. The white audiences were buying 5 times as many records by white cats as any of the black records were doing. Financially, it would have made sense to hire some white cats, if nothing else, just to keep the record label afloat. They're so focused on this revelation of this black intensity, expressing and emoting the black condition. They're so moved by it and just electrified by what they're hearing from these guys in this moment. They don't even put their head up and look around. They're not going, oh, whose contracts? We should bring Jerry Mulligan to make a few records. It's not even on their soundscape. They have no concern with what's happening nationally in jazz, in the white kingdom of jazz, and all the white labels, the major labels. They're not looking to poach names like that they can make quick bucks with. They have no concern for that. And you can't say that about Prestige. They bring in Stan Getz, Riverside brings in Chet Baker, Impulse brings in all kinds of weird white cats, black cats, didn't matter. It's shocking when you really think about it, that the great Blue Note legacy, it just does not have records led by white people, period, after this. And Jackie McLean is mixed. For those of you who want to say, what about Jack? Jackie's a mixed cat. Fine record. I'm on the record for saying white cats can play, but again, they're going to be telling you a very different story than what a black male is going to be telling you. And it's what that black male told Alfred Lion and Frank Wolf when they were in the recording studio, what they were hearing. It was shocking, illuminating, empowering, electrical. It's just, I don't think it's something most of us grasp. I don't think it's something that, unless you have hundreds of Blue Note records, you can really even conceive. It's just not something that you would think would be a thing. But these are the things that make the Blue Note canon what it is. Bud Powell. Something about Bud Powell that most people here aren't going to know. And number 2 on my list, I believe, number 2, yep, is Bud Powell is the last guy to record for Blue Note that was kind of one of the old breed black guys. The number of great black musicians in jazz that had pretty big name reputations from the 50s, from the 40s, even from the 30s. Those guys, there's a lot of them. And Verve does have a lot of them. But almost all these guys have contracts that come up for renegotiation. They're always willing to look and see who's willing to sign them or make a couple records. And Blue Note, once Bud Powell passes away, they worked with Bud Powell in the late 40s, early 50s. Okay, so Bud Powell was a friend, and they knew Bud, and as they were coming up, working with Bechet, they never really worked with Bechet. All the Sidney Bechet stuff is from when he's in France. But when Blue Note's kind of really starting to slowly establish itself, Bud Powell and Monk and Powell was even a bigger name than Monk in some ways at certain points. You can't sell Bud Powell records nowadays compared to Monk, but Powell was a very important figure, and he was a friend of Alfred's, and he leaves Blue Note for a while. He's having health issues. He's in mental institutions. He has suffered an awful beatdown by the police. I believe it was in Philadelphia. He never really was the same after that. He had these lapses. Drugs and alcohol kind of ravaged him. Prescription drugs was part of that concoction. It's a very sad story, the Bud Powell story. But he comes back in 57, 58 and makes 3 records for Blue Note as a leader. And they are fantastic records, first of all. But they also represent the last time Blue Note's going to really bring in an older name. And so we're going into the mid to late 50s. Blue Note has no interest in signing a guy like Dizzy Gillespie, Coleman Hawkins, Roy Eldridge, Sweets Edison, Ben Webster. There's just case after case after case. Duke Ellington, Count Basie. They just don't sign that old guard of jazz giants who again have pretty big names in the commercial retail world. There would probably be some sense to trying to sign Ellington, Armstrong. But Blue Note, once they start down this path, about the same time they get rid of all the white cats and don't bring any back, it's not long after that, by around 1958, but when Bud Powell passes, that they don't really have any of that old generation appear on the label at all. And the closest they probably get to it is probably a guy like Lou Donaldson, who's kind of an in-betweener. And he's not really a swing era cat, but he is definitely from the bebop era. And Parker passes in 55, so he was never going to be a factor. But it's not something the average Blue Note fan recognizes. And when you look around the jazz kingdom, Impulse, which launches in 60, so 2-3 years after what we're even talking about, Impulse, who we always think of as this forward-thinking, progressive label, their discography is filled with records by Pee Wee Russell and Ben Webster and Benny Carter, Dizzy Gillespie. There's George Wein makes a record. There's a litany. Earl Hines. There's a litany of these records at Impulse. Riverside brings in Ellington. Bethlehem's in like 56, 57. And that's so far from what Bethlehem was doing. But they're like, oh, that's probably a good thing for us to have Ellington and his orchestra in the camp for a while. And they make that big Porgy and Bess box set with Ellington's band and all the other Bethlehem artists. And two records as Bethlehem, as Ellington. But you look at all these labels. Prestige is bringing all these cats back. They launched Swingville and Moodsville primarily for that reason. To have a place for Coleman Hawkins to make as many records as he wants. Buddy Tate. Let's give these guys all as much tape as they want. They're old legends. They got name reputations. They'll probably sell pretty well. And you take any label you can think of. And those guys have white records. They have records by these old giants. They have not as refined or defined a sound because they're doing all these disparate things. And Verve, when Creed Taylor comes over, they release a lot of greats out of their contracts to go into that more poppy direction. So there was this litany of great names suddenly available. And it didn't even raise an eyebrow from Alfred Lion, Frank Wolf. That's not... It's like they didn't even lift their head up. They didn't even know what was going on out in the world. You can get so immersed in something that you have no concept of what's happening in the headlines around you. And it's actually a fun place to be because you're so focused, you're so driven that the world could be falling apart, but you're moving so fast it can't catch up to you. You're so focused on your passion, and it feels so important to you to document this that the world be damned. When you catch up to me, we'll talk. But for now, I got to go 90 miles an hour and do what I'm doing. And that kind of drive, you never feel more alive than when you're in that place. When you're like, oh, I know exactly where my focus is on. I need to have, for me, part of that's collecting records, trying to finish off discographies, because it gives me drive, gives me a focus and a purpose and a reason for living. When I lack that, like for me, I've not been able to shop this year much because of my money, and it's been hard not being able to buy records. I hate it. I want to keep growing my collection, my knowledge, my breadth of understanding of the music. But by the way, I got 3 Christmas presents via PayPal from people who have subscribed, who didn't want to join Patreon, but just want to send me a little Christmas thank you. And to all 3 of you guys, thank you genuinely. I'm going to put it towards buying some records. It was a very pleasant surprise. I should have looked up your names. Maybe I'll try to do that and add them in there. But again, that's really cool, guys. Thank you. Thank you to all my Patreon pledge supporters as well. That money's been very integral in helping me stay afloat because my unemployment's barely keeping me paid. So, in recap, number 1, no greatest hits, no Christmas records, no collections. Most people don't really grasp how unique that is. Number 2, how jazz messenger-centric the Blue Note sound and the Blue Note discography is. It's probably over half of the body of work is jazz messenger tree. Number 3, they never made any attempt to hire white cats after J.R. Montrose. It just didn't matter. They had something they were doing. Number 4, they made no attempt to bring in the great giant names of the past once the great Bud Powell passes. And then number 1 on my list, and this I think is it's a revelation I've spoken of before, but it's not the most easy to grasp. Is just how obscure and risky what they were doing was. These are 2 great 10 inches by the great Herbie Nichols. They're Japanese, of course, reissues. The originals go for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. I guess $600 to $1,200 for originals on these. As obscure as that name is to most of us, Herbie Nichols, in 1955, Hank Mobley was just as obscure. Donald Byrd, Lee Morgan, the entire Blue Note canon of artists. Once you get past 1540, they have that early stuff in that 1500 series that was reissued from 10 inches. So your Monks, your Miles Davis, your Fats Navarros, that stuff kind of is all in that early moment when they're reissuing 10 inch stuff from early in the 50s. But for the most part, the body of work that is Blue Note is an incredibly obscure thing to the consumer of that time. There was no stars, there was no big names, there was no white prophet carrying the label on its shoulders. Coltrane makes 1577, and that might be the last big name recording, and Coltrane wasn't a big name when that was recorded. He was starting to crest. You know, he was about to go on to big things, but he was still a sideman in Miles' group and fairly under acknowledged. But it's really hard for us to grasp this. But I challenge people, no matter how big a Blue Note fan you are, think back to when you first started hearing about Blue Note. And you're kind of a new jazz fan. You know Miles Davis. You know John Coltrane. You probably heard some Herbie Hancock fusion stuff. but your knowledge of jazz is minimal, like mine was at one point. And you keep hearing about Blue Note, Blue Note, Blue Note. Oh my God! So you start going, what is this Blue Note label about? Let's go see all the great records by the artists I know on Blue Note. And then when you start to look through that discography, whether you find it in the book or online, and you start diving in, almost 99% of the names the jazz beginner has never even heard of. And some names like Hank Mobley and Horace Silver seem somewhat familiar, especially if a guy like Silver who recorded with Miles once or twice. We know Coltrane, we know Monk, we know Rollins, we know Hancock, who comes to the label later, but we know him from his funk stuff. Like I said, we know the Miles, the Monk stuff, the Rollins stuff. But once you get past that, there's no Coleman Hawkins, there's no Dizzy Gillespie's, there's no Charlie Parker's, there's no Billie Holiday's, there's no Ella Fitzgerald's. All the names, Louis Armstrong's, all the names that we think of and that we know of as jazz. Once we start looking into that Blue Note discography, we recognize pretty quickly that I don't really know any of these names. And I think it's something we all lose sight of as we start collecting more and more Blue Note. And Jackie McLean, Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley becomes more household names to us. We don't really remember that the average person out there in the world doesn't know any of these guys. And that was the case in 1955, 56, 57, 58. Nobody knew these guys. So it's easy for us to look back and go, well, Offerline didn't need to hire the old guys or the white cats because he had this incredible roster of giants. That's not who these guys were. They were unknown. They were commodities that were unproven. They had no track records. Blakey was one of the most experienced guys in that camp, having gone back to the end of the swing era and played with a lot of guys early on, like Monk, and he plays with like Billy Eckstein's orchestra for a while. Parker, they play with Parker, some of these guys, but for the most part, most of these guys in this Blue Note camp were just unknown. And Blakey brings a lot of them into the fold with the Messengers, of course, and they're doing their own scouting with guys like Ike Quebec and Duke Pearson, looking for talent. But what they were looking for is really a finite thing. And like I said, when you roll out that discography and get to know it, it's a couple hundred names that are all black, all pretty much unknown, and that have all kind of ascended in jazz lore to a place of mythology now. So that once we become immersed in jazz, we think Blue Note has always been this hallowed thing. And I'll guarantee you Blue Note sells more now than it did then. And Blue Note's more respected and hallowed now than it was seen as then. But when you take those 5 things together, you really get a sense for just how special what they were doing and documenting is and was. And no other label really gets close. All the other labels do greatest hits. All the other labels bring in big white artists. All the other labels bring in old jazz cats that can sell. A lot of those names at Prestige are pretty big names. So when you're first getting into jazz, Prestige actually is easier to kind of cross. I know Stan Getz. I know Jerry Mulligan. Lee Konitz, sure. Rollins, Miles. Miles makes a lot of music there. It's so Prestige actually seems more prestigious. The Blue Note thing, it's so more obscure and shocking in its relevance and what it comprehends, what it means, than we realize. We take it really kind of for granted and don't really connect with just how special it is. So those are my 5 things that most people don't know about Blue Note. And I hope when you take those 5 things in and grasp what they mean, it really helps elevate for you just how special what Alfred Line and Frank Wolf and the entire body of Blue Note kingdom, how special it is. There's nothing else like it. And maybe a Hank Mobley Christmas record might have been fun. but they had more pressing issues. It was just not on Hank Mobley's radar. Maybe if a guy like Hank had wanted to, they might have let him. But it seems like for the most part, they're addressing serious issues every day. So as obscure as this Herbie Nichols is to most of us still today, that's how obscure most of the names in the Blue Note canon were to the average American in the 1950s, the 1960s, and for the most part, it's how obscure the average Blue Note name is still today to the average American. All three of my brothers, who all know I love and listen to jazz and have the channel, and all three of my brothers would probably struggle to name any Blue Note artists that weren't Monk or Miles. They probably would. You know, it's just they don't have